Hi, welcome to MegaSplat Development Log 17. This is for the 1.06 version of MegaSplat. There have been a number of small fixes and things like that that have gone into the general product, but most of what I've been working on is the texture graph. So there's some really cool new features here. It should make working with the texture graph even faster and more powerful. So let's just dive in and talk about them. So the first thing you'll notice is that the new MegaSplat output node now has inputs for wetness and puddles, which means that you can procedurally place your puddles and wetness in your scene as you texture. So this entire scene here that we're looking at is the example scene. And let me see what I called this. I called it, if you go into Assets, and you go into MegaSplat, Examples, and you go into the new texture graph folder. I have two examples in here. One is called Iceland and one is called California Coast. This one is California Coast. And this entire thing has been textured procedurally. I did not paint any of this. I just created this graph and then I hit a button and it does this. So you can load this up, hit a button, and it will texture your scene like this. Quite cool. So let's go over some of the stuff of how this works. So if you've never used a texture graph, if you didn't watch the last development log, basically what you do is you select your meshes or trains. It works on Unity trains. And you click Prepare Selection. And what this will do is pre-process the data in your selection so that it can transform this data really, really fast using the GPU. So that lets you do a lot of updates and stuff in real time. There's a new option right here called Generate Cavity. And basically this is very similar to generating ambient occlusion. But basically generates a cavity map, which then you can use to texture things. I'll build a little example of this later so we can talk about it more. So I added a comment node, so you'll notice that these are now commented with little comments here saying what they do. As an example here, if we follow the puddle input, basically what I do is I use a combination of the normal angle, which is versus up in this case. You can change this now. I'm using the local one. I should probably be using the world one, but whatever. So I take the normal angle, and I take the current height of the train, and I basically filter them. The normal angle I'm filtering with a curve here, and the idea behind this is that I just want the puddles to show up on relatively flat areas, not on steep areas. And here I'm taking the height and I'm using a new node called a pass filter. And this is sort of like a low pass filter. And it's just basically saying, hey, if you are in the lower area of the height, then you can potentially have puddles. You can see, as I adjust this, you can see the curve updating and you can see the scene updating, allowing it to put puddles higher and higher. This is a little, I don't know if you've seen these little sliders in Unity, but they're kind of neat. They can get a little fidgety, but basically I could have done this with a curve. But editing a curve can be a lot slower because you have to come into this interface and drag these points around. And it's nice just to have this little thing and have a slider and do that. So I created this node just to make the editing process a little bit quicker. And yeah, and so that's basically I basically take this height and normal and filter them so that we only appear on the low areas and we only appear on flat areas. We're going to put puddles. And then what I do is I generate some noise. And so I multiply that filter based on height and filter based by normal together. And then I subtract out the noise. And so what this does is it means that this noise is just going to remove puddles wherever it appears. So if I set the amplitude of this noise to 0, you can see that there are puddles, huge swaths of puddles. It's too much. It doesn't look great. But as I increase the amplitude of this, weird, 0.5, then what it's done is basically just reduce the amount of puddles based on a noise function. And so that gets it a little bit more reasonable and creates something that's pretty pleasing. So that's how I did the puddles in this. Let's talk about the texturing. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a float here, and I'm going to disconnect this blend, and let's just look at the bottom layer, and we'll see how that's done. So hit compile. It compiles the shader, and boom, here we go, we're updated. So what I did for the bottom layer is really simple, and this is a great place to start. I basically have a moss texture, and I have a grass with stone textures. I choose between them based on the normal angle, and again, versus the up angle. So in this case, this node will output 1 when you're faced straight up, and it'll output 0 when you're face down. And so the selector just says, hey, if you are greater than 0.7, then choose these. But if you're less than 0.7, choose this one. And again, these are texture clusters, so they are going to randomly choose textures from that texture set. So here we go. We see we have moss and stuff appears on areas that are facing up, and on areas that are sloped on the side, we start to see this rock and stuff coming in. Now this is just using one layer. We're not doing any complex blends here. We're just doing the basic MegaSplat texture choice stuff. So that's how the bottom layer is done. But to really get the most out of MegaSplat, I think it's really about using the 2 layers, if you're using a 2-layer shader, and blending in lots of textures subtly such that you get really complex interactions. So to do that, we want to have something in our blend value. For now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you what the top layer does. So if I change the blend value to 1, now we're not seeing any of the bottom layer. We're seeing just the top layer. And you'll notice that you have a pretty complex texturing going on here. Don't mind the seam, that's me not making a decent mesh. So here we have, on this bottom area, we have some of the shore stones. We have this mixture of grass and dirty grass, like, it's got little bits of rubble and stuff in it. And then at the top we have sand and sort of stone. So what I did here was filter based on height. Now, you can do this with curves and selectors and things, but it becomes a whole mess of nodes and it becomes really hard to edit. So to make this easier, we talked about that new filter here. We have the pass filter. So the pass filter just says, hey, if you're greater than a value, we're going to let you pass through. This is like an audio signal, low pass filter. And you can see it's got this nice little control. And so any value that comes in here, if it's below this area here, it's going to be 0. And if it's above here, it's going to be 1. And depending on its value, it's going to ramp based on this curve. We can invert this to go the other way if we want to make essentially a low pass filter instead of a high pass filter. And we can even set the minimum and maximum on this to filter that value and kind of change the curve. But I could do this just as well with a curve. So I have another shortcut node in here, which is called the band pass. And if you're not familiar with audio, all a band pass filter is basically saying, hey, anything that's not in this range, like, get rid of it. And as you come into the center point, like, we want to keep that information and do something with it. So this is similar. We're saying that anything that comes, this is 0 and this is 1. So anything that comes below this value of about 0.4, we're going to make 0. Anything that comes in above this, in this range, is going to follow this curve. And anything above this value, which is actually about 0.7, is going to be 1. Or sorry, be 0 again. So it's like the bandpass, but it has both sides. Now, when you adjust this, you can see how it moves. You can see the blend makes it wider or thinner on the transition. And then the width controls how wide that curve is. So you can really shape your curve. But again, you could have done this perfectly fine with a curve control. But this editing interface is a lot faster, especially when you're making adjustments. So what we want to do in this case, or what I've done in this case, is I really wanted to filter the height value based on 3 different heights. I wanted to select the texture here. I wanted to select this texture if we're in the lower area. Then I wanted to select this clustering of textures here if we're in the mid area. And then right at the top, I wanted it to be all sandy. So I could have made a selector node, set that up based on height with a selection 3, and that would have given me the texture selection. But it wouldn't really have let me blend these things in a nice way. So let me just hook up the result here. Let me hit compile. What I really wanted out of this was 2 things. I want to select the texture for the second layer, but I also want to select a weight, right? Because what I want is that as you go up from the bottom here, where we're at 100% this surface, we start fading out this surface, and we see just little bits of it poking through, because that tends to look more natural. So this is where this multiband filter comes in. And again, you can see that what I basically have here is 3 textures coming in. The first one is that shore stand that I'm putting right here on the bottom. The next one is actually a cluster of texture clusters. So I have this grass stones one, which is that sort of dirty grass, and then I have the regular grass, and I blend them together based on noise, which is basically, these are both texture clusters, so there are 3 textures or some number of textures being blended by noise, and I'm just building a higher level version of that, saying, take 2 texture clusters and blend them together based on noise, right? So that becomes my second texture. And then the third texture is this rocky soil. So I'm going to take those 3 textures, and I'm going to take the height value, essentially. Now I've done a little extra noise into the height value, but you don't really have to worry about that. We could do it just with height. So I take that height value, and then what I want to do is construct several of these types of curves that I can quickly control to filter which texture under which height ranges. So let's go in on the multiband here. We have 3 active bands. We have a 4th that we're not using right now. So I have my 3 textures plugged in. I have these 3 bands, and just like that band pass filter, they have a center and a width and a blend value, and they have this range property which says what the min and max of these things are. And finally, they have a built-in subtractive noise. So that's kind of like the trick I did with the puddles earlier, where I'm just subtracting some noise, and this is all built into one control. And what this does is it outputs the final texture for the given control point, and then it outputs a blending value of how this can blend into the other layer. So before, when we plugged in a value of 1 and compiled, this is just going to show that second layer's texture choices. We see now it comes in really strong. We don't have our first layer. And, it still looks pretty cool, but it looks, it's very like, oh, look, you can see the height ranges. But now if I plug in this, take a look, compile it, you get a much more complex blending. Like, look how the dirt really comes in around these edges here. And that just looks like somebody went and painted all that, right? And so we have this very deep, rich blending between our surfaces. You can see here that we get some full force rocks, and then we also get some moss growing in them, and they're sort of nicely blended together at like 50% or so. And so it looks much more like somebody really spent their time painting this. So let's go over how this is done. We have 3 bands that represent our 3 different textures. So, for example, I'm going to go up on this second band here, or it's a third band really, but program is numbered from 0. So this is the band that's bringing in this texture. So I can control the center point, and that will move the band up, right, and I'll let the other textures come through, move it down, and choose kind of where it exists. I have the width and the blend, which again, let me bring up that, just the band pass here. So these are the same controls here, right, in this multi-blend. as we have in this bandpass. So you have a center, you have a blend amount, and you have a width. And then you have a min and a max that says, you know, what's the amplitude and minimum and maximum of that curve. So these are the exact same controls, and probably what I should do is just visualize the channel here. I'll put that on for next release. So same controls, and then you have a subtractive noise built in here. So what does this do? If I turn the noise down, this thing is going to appear pretty much entirely along that band. Okay. Now, let's play with the minimum and maximum values. Let's say I set the maximum value to 0.7, right? You can see how the other layer is now poking through because this value is never going to get above 0.7. If I set the minimum value, again, this probably needs to be, well, at 1 it's completely covering, but if I set the minimum value higher, you can see that it's kind of hard to do here. It's probably better if I show this on a different surface. So we'll get back to that. But basically, as we increase the amplitude of the noise here, what's going to happen is it's going to start subtracting, and it's going to remove value from this, wherever that noise is. So as we amplify the noise, you can see it starts cutting away chunks of that terrain and pushing us down to these lower values. So back to 1. So at 0.9, you know, it's cut out some chunks. If we really increase this, you know, it's going to cut out more and more chunks. So you can sort of play with this and decide how much of that you want to blend in. And again, because we're outputting this blending factor, each of these things is outputting this sort of continuous curve blend amount. And then, like all noises, you can adjust the frequency, which is going to change basically how often it oscillates between, like with a low frequency, you're going to get big wide areas, right? And with a high frequency, if I do a frequency 0.1, you're going to see you get it jumping back and forth more often. So you can play with this noise to sort of control how much and how much it should be sort of broken up. And that will all get output into your blending factor. So let's go down to the lower area here, because I think that's a good place to show them in. So we switch to 0 here. Again, I can move the center. You can see it's just moving up how high those things appear. Same for the width and the blend. They're going to change how these things blend together. And right here, I have a min and a max. So let's see what happens, first of all, if I just get rid of the noise. So if I take out the noise, you can see that you get a much more solid amount of texture, where essentially where you're in the range of the band, it's going to be 100% that texture. Or sorry, it's going to be 0.8 of that texture. So if I set it to 1 and 0, you'll see that this actually fades off with the band. And it's, you know, harsh, whatever. So if I raise the minimum, you'll see that it just kind of is pushing out the sides there. And so in the area where we're doing that blending, it's saying, look, I'm never going to get all the way down to 0. I'm going to, you know, start at 0.3 instead. And this becomes more apparent as we add some of that noise. So if we add noise here, and if I set this to 0, let's go over to the edge here. So this is in the blend region, which is based on that height. And you can see as I bring up that minimum blending, it's bringing up the amount of this texture that's required. And so that can actually look really cool because it sort of pushed little bits of this rock up into that area. Lower it back down. Again, we can increase the amplitude of the noise, and as we change that amplitude, we're going to get different amounts of blending. Lower amplitudes are going to be basically 0 to, or 0.3 to 1 in this case. Higher amplitudes are going to interfere with that more. If we reduce the maximum amount, then you'll see that we never quite get the texture fully blended in, right? And so a lot of these values are kind of sensitive, but you can play with them and really get some nice results. Because I think the MegaSplat looks really the best when you're always blending, right? Like always be blending between textures because you have so many textures available, And essentially the texture clusters are always blending, amongst a given surface to make that surface look unique. And then you can always be blending between layers to make sure that there's constantly something sort of, new or appearing in the cracks or whatever. So for the next patch, I'll probably get some more visualization on this so you can see where each curve is. Maybe I'll put them all three together. I'm not sure yet. But that's basically this multiband curve. I've reorganized the menu a little bit. So basically filters are all your curve controls. Your data is essentially cavity, which we're going to talk about in a moment. The height input, your noise function, normal angles, and the new one is texture mask. So you've got a program that generates a mask for you, and it says, hey, this is where water should be, and you've built this whole terrain with some system, and now you'd like to apply the puddle system there, or you'd like to maybe filter that in some way and put little rocks around that area. Now what you can actually do is you can select any texture, and let me just find something. Yeah, this will work. Sometimes it doesn't quite select. Where was that thing? Here we go. There we go. So now you can select a texture, and basically you get any of the channels out of it and use it for inputs. So if I take this, whatever this texture is, and I'm going to assume that's in the red channel, I put that into the blend, and now I compile. What we should see, if that is indeed not an alpha texture, is a giant O where it blended. Yeah, there we go. You can see how the top layer, which has this texturing, is being blended in an O around our terrain instead of using the mask here. So again, if you have some mask stored in texture information, you can basically use it in the shader graph. Right now it just pulls from the UVs of the mesh or terrain. I probably will add some options for projective UVs and things like that. Let's see what else. Comment node, please use it. Everyone will thank you, including your future self. And yeah, those are the new nodes. Let me just flip over. Oh, I was going to show off cavity. So let's make a new graph. There we go. So we're going to turn on generate cavity. And I'm going to go ahead and set the sample count to 32 and the max distance to 3. And oops, select the meshes, hit prepare. So what it has done is generate this cavity information for this terrain and set it up. So let's use it to do something obvious, right? So we can see what it does. And so what we're going to do is we're going to grab a texture cluster. Oops, and I forgot to select the MegaSplat diffuse here. So here we have one texture cluster, and let's go ahead and add another one. Plug those in here. And now let's choose two different textures. And it's compiling. All right, so we're going to say, for kicks, let's grab that cavity data. I'm going to put that into our blend and compile it. So now what we're saying is that we want to use this cliff texture wherever cavity isn't. Now, one thing you'll note is that there doesn't appear to be a whole lot of non-cavernous terrain right now. We get some little bits here and there, and that's probably because the cavity value needs some amplification. So let's just go ahead and multiply that. Actually, you know what? Let's not multiply it. Let's pow it. Pow multiplies a number by itself. If you're not familiar, 1 times 1 is always 1, but 1 times anything less than 1 gets more or less than 1 until it's 0. So what pow does is act as a contrast node. Let's compile that. And let's go ahead and make the value higher, lower. And so you can see here that what it's trying to do is put the lava, in this case, which is not the greatest example, in the cavernous areas here. So wherever we have this sort of occlusion happening because we're in like sort of a ditch, it is putting more of the lava texture. And wherever we have areas that are like this ridge, it is not putting the cavity in, or not putting the lava texture. Now there is a little caveat on this, is that this is computed per vertex. And so often when working in this graph, when you're using things like normal angle, we tend to think of those as sort of continuous functions over the surface because we interpolate them in a pixel shader, but in this case it's just looking at the vertices. And then the blending is not looking at that per pixel, it's just choosing a texture. So like for instance here you can see that it chose the right textures all along these ridges and chose the right texture here, but that doesn't mean that this texture doesn't bleed over because of the height mapping, right? So like it still managed to go over that area a little bit. So it's a very loose approximation, but if you have particularly contrasty terrain, it will grab those spots for you, and with the right amount of filtering, I have it powered up very high right now, you can see that it will find those little crevices, and you can use that to drive texture choice. You can use it to blend between things, multiply into your blending. Maybe you want to strengthen your top layer or your bottom layer based on this cavity information. And again, the whole thing about this is that you can use noise. Coherent noise is great. It's so much better than randomly choosing things. But a level above that is tying things to actual information. So tying things to height, tying things to normal angle and cavity provide a level of consistency and realism across your scene that is hard to get with just pure noise. So yeah, those are the new nodes. I'm probably going to work on this for a little while longer, but I think this thing is getting pretty close to complete. Let me just load my other example here. Graph. There we go. Pilot. And so you can see how quickly you can apply this stuff to terrains and get very different looks. So one of the things I want to do is work with some people who author terrain textures and basically take their packs, work with them with their packs, get them set up for MegaSplat. So if you're looking for a certain style of terrain, you could buy that texture pack, and it would have some of these procedural texturing techniques already there. And so you could open up your scene, slap on a base coat with this, get a basic texturing going, have the scene look great, and then just start painting the things that you really care about, that you want to be, unique or want gameplay around. But again, the idea being that you can load up one of these graphs and just hit a button and get a style of texturing, which is pretty awesome. So let me just see if there's anything else worth talking about in my notes really quick. New nodes. Added the cluster noise scale to runtime painting. There's actually a bug that shipped with this version that's been in there for a long time. Somebody posted on the forum. Thank you very much. A fix for that, if you need it. It does not choose texture clusters correctly in runtime painting. That will be in 1.07. I finally fixed the last known issue with white text on a white background in the light skin mode. I also fixed that for the texture graph because it was not drawing correctly at all in the white skin or light skin mode. I found there's a biasing going on in the CPU side displacement. I still need to look into this more, but I managed to get it a lot closer now, which is good. Fixed a ton of stuff in the texture graph. I think the texture graph is nearing complete. There's a few more little niceties I can add to it. But if you have ideas for nodes that would be useful, if you've got some experience playing with it, I'd love to hear it. There's also the question of whether it makes sense to do some script to calculate flow vectors automatically so that your puddles can flow the correct direction. Right now it's just going to use whatever happens to be on the UVs, which may or may not be correct. So yeah, I think that's it for this development diary, and hope you're enjoying these. Hope you're enjoying MegaSplat. It's on sale right now, so pick it up if you don't have it, and thanks a lot.